Seward, Alaska is a port city that's about 60 miles south of Anchorage, and it's home to one of the oldest foot races in America called the Mount Marathon Race. Now, this race is not actually a marathon because a marathon by definition is 26.2 miles long. The Mount Marathon Race is actually only 3 miles long, but it's considered one of the most challenging short races in the world because it's basically 1.5 miles straight up a mountain and then 1.5 miles straight back down again. Despite its grueling nature, there had never been a fatality or a disappearance during the running of this race, but that changed in 2012. 66-year-old Alaskan resident Paul LeMaitre was a career counselor on a military base in Anchorage. His job was to help outgoing military members adjust to civilian life, and his primary responsibility was helping them with their resume. Outside of work, Paul liked to keep himself in top physical shape, and one of his favorite activities was going for runs. And so in 2012, he finally committed to running the Mount Marathon Race, something he had wanted to do for some time, but he kept putting it off. In the months leading up to the race, Paul trained hard to make sure he was ready. He wasn't trying to win the race or really even be competitive. He just wanted to finish the race in a respectable time. So at 3 p.m. on July 4th, 2012, Paul found himself at the start of the Mount Marathon Race, and his family was on the sidewalk cheering him on. The race director fired the starting gun, and Paul, along with 500 other racers, took off. For reference, a man of Paul's age and physical fitness level should be able to complete this race in about 2 hours or less. But at 5 p.m., when virtually all the other runners had finished the race and Paul was nowhere to be found, his family members were concerned, but they knew he wasn't trying to win the race. They knew he was probably going to be on the slower end, but they were now starting to pay attention and were anxious for him to show up. 45 minutes later, a race timing crew up at the top of the mountain at the turnaround point began breaking down their setup. About 15 minutes later, when they were done, they started walking down the mountain right as Paul showed up at the top. And they said to him, "You are the last racer on this course. Do you still want to continue?" And he said, "Yes, I definitely still want to continue." And so the timing crew said, "That's fine. Just take your time, be careful, and we'll see you at the bottom." And so the timing crew, they take off right in front of Paul, going straight down this well-marked course, and they would turn around and see Paul standing there, catching his breath, getting ready to make his own descent. And so the timing crew, who was moving much faster than Paul, very quickly got out of sight of him. And so before long, they were at the bottom, they turned around, and there's no sign of Paul. So they went and found Paul's family and said, "Hey, we just spoke to him. He seems totally fine, but just so you know, if you don't see him in 90 minutes, I would contact the race officials and let them know, because he should be down by then." And so Paul's family sat at the bottom of this race looking up, expecting to see him any moment, but 90 minutes came and went and he never showed up. They wound up waiting another 30 minutes just in case, but again, he didn't show up, and so they informed race officials. The race officials immediately contacted the Alaskan State Troopers, and a search was launched for him because now fog's rolling in, this is a dangerous course, and it's starting to get pretty late. All night, hundreds of expert Alaskan searchers combed this mountain, both on the course, outside the course. They even went on the backside of Mount Marathon, where it would have been extremely difficult for Paul to have gotten there. He would have had to climb up and over the mountain, which is just extremely unlikely, but they figured we can't leave any stone unturned. And so all night they're looking, they got dogs out, and there's no sign of him. The next morning, when the fog cleared up, they brought in helicopters with thermal cameras, and they continued to search the mountain. But after 4 more days, they never found Paul or any of his belongings, and so they called off the search. It was like Paul had just vanished. Now, it's easy to jump to the conclusion that Paul must have just gotten disoriented and lost the course track, and then maybe he fell, or he was attacked by an animal like a bear, because this is Alaska. But there's a couple problems with that. The first one is the course itself is extremely well marked. This race is one of the oldest in America. They've been doing this for over 100 years, and they've never had a missing person or a fatality. So they know how to keep people safely inside of the course bounds. The other issue is the timing crew saw Paul at the top, at the turnaround, and he was physically okay. He was talking to them, he was not distressed, and he would have very clearly seen where to go next, because he would have seen the timing crew leaving ahead of him, going down the trail that he would have to follow. Clearly, something unusual happened to Paul either at the summit after the timing crew left or on the way down, because rational explanations cannot account for how Paul could vanish so completely in such a controlled environment with so many expert searchers looking for him. But to this day, no one has ever found Paul or even the slightest trace that he was ever on that mountain. In late August of 2004, Kevin Bardsley and his 12-year-old son Garrett went on a father-son Boy Scout camping trip in the Uinta Mountains in northern Utah. Their campsite was situated next to Lake Quiberon inside of the Wasatch National Forest. The lake was actually pretty remote and difficult to access because it was almost completely surrounded by huge mountains. The only side you could get to the lake on was its western side, but the western trail leading to it was very cumbersome because you had to bypass 7 different lakes. And so by the time Kevin, Garrett, and the rest of the Boy Scouts and their fathers were at the lake, they were at least an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization. Early in the morning on August 20th, Kevin and Garrett woke up, they hopped out of their tents. None of the other campers had woken up yet, and so they decided they would head down to the lake to get some early fishing in. And so they got their gear and they began walking down the very well-defined 150-meter long trail down to the lake. As they get there, the sun's coming up over the mountains and they're really excited about their day of fishing. And so as Kevin is preparing a fishing rod for Garrett, Garrett was jumping around on different stones that were poking out of the water. And at some point he tripped and he fell into the water, soaking his shoes and his pants. And so he hopped out of the water and he's kind of laughing at himself, and he told his dad that he didn't care. He'd fish with wet feet and wet pants and he would change them later. And so Kevin laughed and handed his son his fishing rod, and then the two of them began to fish. After a while, when they hadn't caught anything, Garrett said to his dad that, "You know what, Dad, this is actually pretty uncomfortable. I'm gonna go change my pants and my socks." And so Kevin said, "No problem, I'll be here with our gear. I'll see you when you get back." And so Garrett stands up and he starts walking back up the well-defined 150-meter trail back up towards the campsite. And Kevin actually turned around and watched his son disappear into the trees, but he heard the sound of other campers at the campsite and so knew his son wouldn't be alone. For the next couple of minutes, Kevin kept fishing, but periodically would look over his shoulder expecting to see Garrett come out of the woods again, but he didn't. And after about 20 minutes, Kevin was a little bit concerned, so he picked up his fishing gear and began walking back up the trail towards the camp. When he got there, he saw other Boy Scouts and their fathers just getting up and having a bite to eat, and he's scanning around the campsite and he doesn't see Garrett, and so he goes over to Garrett's tent and he opens it up and Garrett's not in there, and there's no sign that he's removed any of his wet clothing in there. And so Kevin turns around and he asks one of the fathers, "Hey, have you seen Garrett? He was supposed to be up here a minute ago." And the father said, "No, I haven't seen him." And so Kevin's starting to panic and he yells out to the group, "Hey, has anyone seen my son? Do you guys know where Garrett went? He was supposed to be up here." And no one knew where he was. They said, "No, we haven't seen him." And so horrified, Kevin drops all of his gear and starts running back towards the lake, screaming for his son. And the other campers instinctively know what's going on, and so they chase after him, yelling for Garrett. Almost immediately, the sheriff's department was notified, and they launched this huge search that included the FBI. And so hundreds of people have descended into the area around the lake, and they're looking for Garrett. They can't find him, but later that afternoon, searchers were about a half mile away from where Garrett was last seen, and they found a single Nike sock that appeared to have been removed from a wet foot wedged into one of the boulders in this huge boulder field. Garrett's mother would confirm that was Garrett's sock, and so the search effort was shifted to this big boulder field, and for days they looked all over the place for him, but there was no sign of Garrett anywhere, and so eventually the search was terminated. The authorities determined this was an accident, that Garrett's father and the other campers had nothing to do with Garrett's disappearance. What their theory was is Garrett must have gotten lost on the walk back to the camp and then ultimately died of exposure. But the idea that a boy of Garrett's age would get lost along a well-defined 150-meter long trail that he was familiar with, that he had been on that day, that seems a little far-fetched. Also, as Garrett was walking down that trail, he would have heard the sounds of the other campers in the campsite. So that would have helped him figure out exactly where he needed to go. He's on a well-marked trail, he's walking towards the sound of the voices. But he never made it to the campsite because no one at the camp saw him, and there was no sign that he had put his wet clothes in his tent. So something happened to Garrett almost immediately when he left his father that caused him to wind up a half mile away in a boulder field with one sock missing. It screams abduction case. But remember, this campsite was over an hour's hike away from the nearest civilization, and they know this group of Boy Scouts and their fathers were the only ones in the area that day. It is possible that an animal could have taken Garrett, like a mountain lion, but there would have been signs of a struggle, and they didn't find any on the trail or anywhere nearby, and you would figure if he was getting dragged off by a big predator, he would have yelled out for help, but he didn't. He just left his dad, it was total silence, and then he vanished. And all we have is his one sock. In 1950, when Rosemary was 21 years old, she married the love of her life, Charles Bud Kunst, and they moved into a house together in San Anselmo, California. Together, they had 6 children and 11 grandchildren. They were known as a very active couple, that when they were not with their family and their grandkids, they were out on a hiking trail somewhere enjoying the outdoors. In 1998, Rosemary's life was derailed when she and her husband were in a horrific car accident. When she came to in the hospital, she was very badly injured, and she was told that her husband of nearly 50 years had not survived. Rosemary was devastated. She was lost without Bud. But for the next several months, she poured her energy into her rehab, which took up a lot of her time, and it kept her mind off of this terrible loss. But when she got back to strength and returned home, a wave of grief washed over her, and she began to desperately miss Bud. In 2000, when Rose turned 70, she heard about a backpacking trip that was being led by a group called the Earth Circle Organization, and it sounded like the perfect way for Rose to attempt to reconnect with her late husband. The group was led by an elder and chief of the Carrick tribe. His name was Charlie Red Hawk Tom, and every year he would bring this group out to Spirit Lake, which is inside of a wilderness area near Mount Shasta in California, and there they would go to the altar that Red Hawk had built right on the edge of this lake, and they would perform spirit dances and attempt to communicate with their dead loved ones. Rose wasn't going into this thinking she was literally going to be speaking to Bud. She wanted to just find a way to connect with him spiritually, so she was very excited about this trip. The lake itself sits at the base of a heavily forested bowl with high steep walls all around it. In fact, some people say it reminds them of being inside of a mini volcano. And because of those high steep walls, there's actually only one way in or out to the lake, and that's on the north side. The only other semi-feasible way to get in or out of the lake would be on the south side, where a river flows down into the lake. And where that river flows, the embankment is less steep, although it's still a 70-degree angle and would require climbing gear, and the terrain would be completely slick from the water running over it. So you could do it, but realistically, nobody does that. So on August 17th, Rosemary, along with Red Hawk's 12-year-old son, a cook, and 11 other people, set out for Spirit Lake. After a rigorous 12-mile horseback ride, they finally arrived at Spirit Lake, and they established their camp right on the trail that leads in and out. That night, all the participants had dinner together, and then they made their way over to the altar right next to the lake where Red Hawk was, and he performed a spirit dance, and then afterwards, as a group, they attempted to call out to their dead loved ones. The following morning at 9 a.m., once everyone was up, Red Hawk informed the group that they were going to take a day trip to another lake, and they'd be back that evening. Rose told Red Hawk that she'd actually prefer to just stay at their campsite and enjoy the beauty of the lake, and Red Hawk told her that was just fine. So Red Hawk and the main group left, leaving behind Rosemary, as well as Red Hawk's 12-year-old son named Chalet, and the cook. A little while later, at 1 p.m., Rose decided she wanted to take a little hike around the side of the lake, and so she asked Chalet if he wanted to join her. He said, "Thank you for the offer, but I'm going to stay here with the cook." And so Rosemary said, "That's totally fine. I don't mind going by myself." And so she asked the cook for some food. He handed her a bag lunch. She took it, said thank you, and then set off by herself heading south. 4 hours later, at 5 p.m., when Red Hawk and the rest of the group got back to the camp, Chalet and the cook informed him that Rosemary had not come back yet. A group was immediately sent out to look for her, but there was no sign of her. And so Red Hawk turned to his son and to the cook and said, "Explain to me again what happened." And they said she was totally normal. She just wanted to go for a hike, and she took some food, and we watched her disappear into the trees. They also told Red Hawk that they had been sitting in the trail that leads in and out of the lake the entire time Rosemary was gone, and they never saw her. So she didn't leave the lake. She's somewhere out there. Confused and very concerned, Red Hawk had one of the other participants leave the lake and go contact authorities, and within 24 hours, there were 50 searchers combing the lake for Rosemary. The head of the search and rescue team was a guy named Grizz Adams, who had led many other search and rescue efforts. After studying the area and talking to Chalet and the cook and the others who were there, he just could not understand how a 70-year-old woman had managed to vanish so quickly and completely, because there's no way she climbed out the south exit because she didn't have climbing gear, and physically she probably wasn't capable of that even with the right gear, and she didn't leave through the north exit, the main trail, because Chalet and the cook were there the entire time and they never saw her. So where was she? As the search continued to find nothing, Grizz called in more searchers on horseback, helicopters, and dog teams. But the dog teams immediately proved to be useless because they were unable to pick up her scent, despite the fact they knew exactly where she started and where she was going. Grizz said that was highly unusual. For the next several days, searchers looked in and around the lake and up onto the mountainsides, and all they could ever find was a small tuft of Rosemary's hair about a half-mile away from where she was last seen. But this hair did not help investigators come up with a theory as to what happened. Ultimately, after almost a week of searching and not finding their mother, Rosemary's children elected to terminate the search. Grizz Adams, the head of the search effort, said the only time he's ever seen something like this is when someone was trying to disappear. They were trying to end their life. But Rosemary, before she went on this hike, she asked Chalet to come with her. She wanted company. That's not indicative of someone that's trying to hurt themselves. But regardless of the reason, to this day, Rosemary has never been found. So that's going to do it, guys.
On Christmas Day 2011,
67-year-old Hervey Medellin turned off the oven in his apartment in Hollywood, California, opened up the oven door, and pulled out a casserole dish covered with foil. Hervey looked up at the clock and smiled, because his friend, who was coming over for a holiday visit, would be there any minute, and the food he was making had finished cooking at exactly the right time. He turned down the radio playing Christmas music in the kitchen and called out to his roommate, Gabriel Martinez, and told him lunch was almost ready. Gabriel had his eyes glued to his laptop, totally engrossed in whatever it was he was doing, and so he just gave Hervey a sort of grunt of acknowledgement. Hervey responded with an irritated sigh. Gabriel, who was 30 years younger than Hervey, had been spending so much time online lately that he barely connected with the world around him. Hervey realized it was very likely a generational thing, but he didn't understand why anyone would want to spend so much time just staring at a computer screen. But Hervey refused to be bothered by Gabriel today. It was Christmas, and Christmas was a time for joy, friends, and good food. Hervey set down the hot casserole dish on the table in the small dining area, and he looked around with satisfaction at all the Christmas decorations he had spent hours hanging up. Hervey's entire one-bedroom apartment now looked like it had been decorated by a professional interior designer. But perhaps the most impressive part of the decorations was not actually the Christmas stuff. It was the paintings that were hanging on the walls. These were not paintings that would be found in most small one-bedroom apartments. These were original works by famous artists. Just then, the doorbell rang, interrupting Hervey's thoughts, and Hervey removed his oven mitts and went to open the door. And when he did, he saw his friend Amelia standing there, holding several wrapped presents. Hervey grinned and said Merry Christmas and gave Amelia a big hug. Then he led her inside and told her to put the presents down because before they got to presents and to food, he had to show her something. Amelia put down the presents, said hello to Gabriel, and then Hervey took her hand and led her across the front room. Then Hervey pointed to a painting hanging on the wall, and he could hear Amelia gasp. She turned to Hervey almost in disbelief and asked if it was an original. Hervey smiled and nodded. He said the last time he'd gone down to Mexico, where he was originally from, he had acquired this painting, which was an original work of art by Diego Rivera, one of the most famous Mexican painters to have ever lived. After staring at this painting with his friend for several minutes, Hervey said it was time to go eat. He told Gabriel to put his computer away for a while and join them, and then the three of them headed to the table and dug into the casserole Hervey had prepared. While they ate, Hervey told Amelia more about his latest trip to Mexico and also about the travel plans he was making to destinations all over the world. Hervey said sometimes he still couldn't believe this was actually his real life. He'd worked so hard from the moment he came to the United States as a young man, with the hope that one day he'd be able to do whatever he wanted. And now he felt like he'd accomplished that. He was retired and filling his days with adventure and art. Hervey, Amelia, and Gabriel spent the day eating, talking, laughing, and exchanging gifts. For Hervey, who had spent most of his life far away from his family, this really felt like the perfect holiday. And other than maybe traveling, he couldn't imagine a better way to spend his time than eating delicious food and catching up with friends. By late afternoon, Amelia said unfortunately she had to go home, so Hervey walked her to the door. He gave her another big hug, wished her Merry Christmas again, and said he couldn't wait to get together with her in the new year. More than 3 weeks later, on the morning of Tuesday, January 17th, a dog walker named Lauren Kornberg left her house with her mother and 9 dogs. They headed toward their usual hiking path, which cut through an area called Bronson Canyon. Bronson Canyon is located inside of Griffith Park, which is basically LA's equivalent to New York's Central Park, but it sits high above the city. It was the perfect winter morning in Los Angeles, which meant it was a crisp 50 degrees and the Hollywood Hills were bathed in soft orange sunlight. So Lauren and her mom took the dogs up a side path that branched out from the main hiking trail, and once they were far enough away from other hikers, they let the dogs off leash. And as soon as that happened, the dogs instantly began playfully running around together, but one of them, a golden retriever, broke away from the pack and wandered over toward a bushy area next to a shallow ravine off the side of the path. And this golden retriever began digging in this one area of the brush. Lauren watched as the retriever pulled out a plastic bag from the brush and then began sniffing it. And as the dog began to sort of vigorously paw at this bag, a large round object suddenly rolled out of it and began tumbling down into the ravine.
two other dogs from the group, a husky and a small terrier, ran down the ravine after this big round object. And Lauren's mom asked what had just rolled out of the bag. Lauren said she didn't know, but it sort of looked like a movie prop, which wouldn't actually be an unusual thing to find lying around, because there were Hollywood special effects and prop houses not too far from here, and many movies and TV shows were filmed in this area. Lauren's mom walked over toward the ravine to try to get a better look at this movie prop, but as she got close to the edge, she looked down and saw that the dogs were no longer playing. In fact, the terrier was backing away from this object with its hair up, like the dog was terrified. And so Lauren, she kind of leaned forward and looked as best as she could to see what this object was. And suddenly, when one of the dogs stepped out of the way, she had a clear line of sight onto this object. And when she saw what it was, she began backing away too. Because the object was no prop. It was a real severed human head. About an hour later, helicopters loudly hovered over the canyon and police blocked access to the entire area, as more than a dozen LAPD cruisers, CSI units, and news vans parked along the nearby scenic overlook. Detective Chuck Knowles and his partner, Detective Lisa Sanchez, walked up the trail and met with the uniformed officers who had cordoned off the area with police tape. By this point, crime scene investigators had retrieved the severed head from the ravine and brought it onto the trail. When Detective Sanchez walked over to them and saw the severed head, her stomach churned. She had investigated her fair share of murder cases, but this was the first time she dealt with any kind of dismemberment. As Sanchez began to study the head, one of the uniformed officers walked up to her and told her that the two women who actually found the head at first thought it was fake. They thought it was a movie prop. Detective Sanchez could understand why, because there was very little decomposition, and the head was so fresh and pristine that it looked like it had just been removed. From the looks of it, Sanchez believed the head belonged to a man who could be in his 60s, but that was about all she could guess about the victim at this point. So police began fanning out and searching the area, hoping to find some more clues. More helicopters and search units began to pour into the area, and the search expanded to a 7-acre radius. Searchers began entering backyards of the homes in the area, and some of these homes were really expensive houses that belonged to famous movie stars, so the police knew this case was going to draw even more media attention. Around 4:30 p.m., the sun began to set, and despite an exhaustive search of the area, no further human remains turned up. So the searchers left their equipment, kept the area cordoned off, and went home for the night. That evening, reports of the dismembered body found in Griffith Park were all over local news stations. And although violent crime in LA was far from rare, violent crime in this particular neighborhood in Bronson Canyon was almost unheard of. The people who lived in the neighborhood, who were willing to talk on camera, were shocked that something like this could happen just beyond their backyards. People who had been hiking and walking their dogs in Bronson Canyon for years told reporters they were now afraid to step foot on the hiking paths until the killer or killers were apprehended. The following day, LAPD returned to Bronson Canyon and performed a highly organized grid search, scouring the area where the head had turned up. The police were already feeling pressure from the media, city leaders, and local residents to find the people or person who had committed this horrific crime. But Detectives Knowles and Sanchez knew there was still so much physical area to cover and search, and they still had no idea who the victim even was. So this just didn't seem like a case they could just wrap up in a couple of days. And by late morning, the searchers had still found nothing new when a police truck pulled up and a dog handler stepped out with her cadaver dog, a German Shepherd named Indiana Bones, who was famous for being the first four-legged detective on LA County Coroner's team. After getting out of the car, Indy's handler began leading the dog up a nearby hill, and almost immediately as they began to walk, Indy pulled the handler in the direction of this nearby dirt mound. The handler walked over to the mound and, with a gloved hand, began pushing the dirt aside, revealing what looked like a shallow grave. And in this shallow grave was a plastic bag. The handler reached her hands down and carefully cupped them beneath the bag and gently pulled it out of the ground. Then she took a pair of scissors out of her pocket, cut the bag open, and looked inside. And inside, she saw a pair of human feet and a hand. The next morning, Detective Knowles and Sanchez sat at their computers, sifting through recent missing person reports. The victim's torso, or any more of his body, still had not been found. But the detectives hoped that the feet and hand that were found also belonged to their victim, and that with these new body parts, they might be able to connect their victim to somebody who went missing in the area. Just then, the sound of a fax machine broke their focus. Knowles stood up, tore the paper off the machine, and saw that the medical examiner had completed his examination on the severed hand, feet, and head. Knowles scanned the whole report and then read aloud the important parts to Sanchez. The medical examiner had confirmed that all those body parts belonged to the same victim. Also, they said that after the victim was dead, his killer carefully cut apart the man's body, right at the joints, in a very precise manner. So whoever cut the body up seemed to really know what they were doing. But what was even more intriguing was that the body parts had been refrigerated before they were dumped, which explained why the head had looked so fresh when it was found. But this made it difficult for the medical examiner to pin down exactly when the victim was killed. However, because the parts were so fresh, the examiner was able to lift very clear fingerprints from the man's fingers. And when he ran those prints through a system, he got a hit. The dismembered man was Hervé Medellin. Knowles sat down at his computer and ran Hervé's name through every database he had access to. And he quickly learned that Hervé had been reported missing just a day before his head was found. The missing persons report had been filed by a man named Gabriel Martinez, who said he was Hervé's roommate. So Detective Knowles and Sanchez got into their car and began driving towards Hervé's apartment, which happened to be just 2 blocks away from the Hollywood police station. While they were in the car, Knowles and Sanchez discussed their game plan for when they talked to this roommate. And their plan was simple: reveal nothing. Although news of the grisly discovery was already all over town, that victim's identity had not yet been released by the media. Only the police knew that information. And so they wanted to feel out what Hervé's roommate knew and didn't know. He was not a suspect yet, but he was definitely a person of interest. The detectives parked at the curb and walked up to Hervé's building. It was this elegantly plain, narrow building constructed in the 1920s that felt totally vintage and old Hollywood. The detectives walked up the stairs to the 3rd floor, to apartment 319, and rang the doorbell. A few seconds later, the door opened and a dark-haired man in his 30s greeted the detectives. They introduced themselves and asked if he was Gabriel Martinez. Gabriel said yes, and then asked immediately if they had news about Hervé. Had they found him? Was he okay? The detectives exchanged a quick glance, and then Sanchez said they were still investigating Hervé's disappearance. And for now, they just needed to speak to Gabriel to try to help with that case. Gabriel suddenly went from being sort of hopeful to looking pretty concerned, but then told them he was glad to tell them anything they wanted, and he asked them to come inside. Once inside, they all sat down at the table in the small dining area. Detective Knowles asked Gabriel when he'd last seen Hervé, and Gabriel said not since shortly after Christmas, on December 27th. That's when Hervé had gone to Mexico. It was where he grew up and where he still had friends and family. Gabriel said that Hervé traveled internationally a lot, and sometimes he would go on these open-ended trips, so Gabriel was not always exactly sure when Hervé was going to come home again. But Hervé had been calling pretty regularly just to check in, and then suddenly the call stopped. So Gabriel started to get really worried and then eventually filed the missing person report. Detective Sanchez asked Gabriel if he had called or texted Hervé after Hervé stopped calling, just to see if maybe he was staying in Mexico longer. Gabriel said he hadn't, but he explained that Hervé had actually left his cell phone behind at the apartment because he didn't get service in Mexico. Now, Gabriel knew there were ways around that, but he said discussing technology with Hervé was usually a losing cause. Hervé just preferred to use a landline and an international calling card whenever he was in Mexico. Sanchez asked if there was a record of these calls from Hervé, and Gabriel said yes, and he grabbed his phone and showed the detectives the calls he'd received from Hervé in January. The detectives saw that these calls were from an international calling card number, which meant they didn't actually know who placed those calls, but it did corroborate what Gabriel had told them. The detectives would talk to Gabriel for a bit longer, but the whole time they stuck to their original plan. They didn't reveal anything about Hervé's murder. Back at the station, Detective Knowles and Sanchez went over what they had so far, and they agreed it was not very much. And what little they did have didn't quite add up. And it really had to do with this trip to Mexico they had just learned about. Did Hervey really go to Mexico and then get murdered and dismembered there? And then his body parts were shipped back to LA and dumped in LA? Or did Hervey come back from Mexico in one piece and then somehow get intercepted before he got home by somebody who then murdered, dismembered, and dumped him? Both these theories just seemed like they were missing something. Like, did Hervey really even go to Mexico? They didn't know. I mean, regardless of what Hervey's roommate Gabriel had told them, the detectives thought it actually made a whole lot more sense that somebody would have killed and dismembered Hervey right there in his own apartment and disposed of him in nearby Griffith Park, which certainly made Gabriel seem very suspicious. The following day, which is now 3 days after Hervey's head had been found, the detectives returned to Hervey's apartment, and this time they showed up with a search warrant, a team of police, and cadaver dogs. Once inside, they let the dogs loose, and the dogs began frantically sniffing around the floorboards, the furniture, and the corners of every room. Meanwhile, Gabriel sat at the table and watched in silence as the investigators practically tore up the tiny one-bedroom apartment. The search team rifled through drawers and closets, they confiscated computers and phones, and they photographed every item inside the apartment. But at the end of the search, they realized they had found absolutely nothing. There was no blood, no hidden torso, no bone saws or other dismemberment tools, and so this apartment just didn't appear to be the place where the murder or dismemberment or both took place. As the search team began to leave the apartment, Detectives Knowles and Sanchez sat down at the table with Gabriel. And Gabriel didn't look angry or raise his voice, but he wanted to know, what had changed since they spoke a day earlier that made the detectives feel like they could come into his and Hervey's home and tear it apart like this. Sanchez whispered something to Knowles, and then she finally broke the news to Gabriel. Those body parts that were found in the canyon that were all over the news belonged to Hervey. Hervey was deceased, and so now Hervey's death was being investigated as a homicide. Immediately, all the color drained from Gabriel's face. He said he couldn't believe it. This didn't seem real. Now, the detectives understood how upsetting this was for Gabriel, but they needed more information. So they pressed Gabriel for more details about Hervey's trip to Mexico. And so, for the next half hour, Gabriel, despite being in shock, was cooperative and answered every question and tried to give detectives any information at all that could be useful. Later that day, the two detectives returned to the station and went into an evidence room where everything collected from Hervey's apartment was laid out on a table. One of the evidence technicians in the room told the detectives that he happened to look at the photos taken of the apartment, and some of the victims' artwork hung on the walls was worth a ton of money. The Diego Rivera painting alone was likely worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Now, this struck the detectives as being really odd. According to the information Gabriel had provided, and based on what the detectives had learned from their databases, Hervey was a retiree, living on a small pension in a small one-bedroom apartment. So how was he also a serious art collector, able to acquire paintings that were potentially worth a small fortune? The following day, so now 4 days after Hervey's head was discovered, a call came through to Knowles' desk. The man on the other end introduced himself as a retired LAPD narcotics detective, and this retired detective said he'd been reading the newspaper that morning and happened to see that the dismembered victim from Griffith Park had been identified. And when he saw the name, Hervey Medellin, it immediately rang a bell. He said back in the early 1990s, when he was investigating a Mexican drug cartel, Hervey's name had come up in the investigation. And in fact, he had interviewed Hervey a couple of times. Knowles kept listening, but right away his mind began to race. A connection to Mexican cartels and drug trafficking could maybe explain how Hervey had enough cash to buy those famous paintings. The retired detective explained that Hervey had worked as a ticket taker for Mexicana Airlines. At that time, that airline was believed to have been used for drug smuggling. And Hervey had become a kind of personal concierge for the wives and girlfriends of drug cartel members. When these women would visit LA, Hervey would book their hotel rooms, arrange shopping trips, and give them dining recommendations. Now, none of that was illegal, so the narcotics detective had no reason to pursue Hervey. He ultimately just kind of became a minor character in a much bigger investigation. But now that this former detective found out that Hervey had turned up dead and dismembered, he wondered if maybe Hervey's connection to the drug cartels had gone much deeper than he realized. As Knowles listened, he was having the same type of thoughts. Was Hervey a drug mule? Were those paintings a form of payment from the cartels? Did Hervey fail to repay a debt, and did the cartel brutally murder him for it? After all, some Mexican cartels were known to behead and dismember some of their victims. Knowles thanked the retired detective for reaching out to him. He hung up and passed this new information along to his partner Sanchez. The detectives now realized they could be in over their heads. Poking the hornet's nest with a Mexican drug cartel is the kind of thing that gets people killed, even cops. Over the next week, Knowles and Sanchez started to pursue this new lead, but they quickly discovered that a potential run-in with a violent Mexican drug cartel was actually not the biggest issue they were facing. Instead, the big issue that kept setting them back was just old-fashioned bureaucracy. Getting Mexican law enforcement agencies to cooperate in any investigation was never really easy, but when the investigation involved the cartels, it seemed almost impossible. Mexican authorities weren't eager to anger the cartels or possibly jeopardize their own investigations into the drug trade just to assist LA cops on a homicide case. And when Knowles and Sanchez turned to federal law enforcement agencies in the United States, they ran into similar problems. The DEA and the FBI were running multiple investigations involving the cartels, and they could not put those at risk just because Hervey had been interviewed by a narcotics cop over 20 years ago. But the FBI did at least tell Knowles and Sanchez that they would dig into Hervey's financial records to see if he had a clear connection to the cartels before he was killed. In the meantime, the feds told the LA detectives to go ahead and stay away from the cartel stuff and just let them handle that. They should just focus on leads that were in the United States. Now, Knowles and Sanchez understood why the feds reacted that way, but they still felt like a huge lead, i.e. going after the cartels, had just been yanked out from under them. On top of that, the FBI had no reason to expedite finding these financial records because this was not their case, so there was no telling how long it would actually take the feds to provide them with any information. Feeling frustrated and a bit lost on what to do next, Knowles and Sanchez turned their focus back to the victim. The detectives reached out to Hervey's LA friends to learn more about who Hervey was. And the picture that began to emerge of Hervey was of a warm, friendly guy who had moved to LA from Mexico as a young man, who had worked hard and was now enjoying his retirement and living the American dream that he had always believed in. Now, Knowles and Sanchez didn't think any of this information really helped their case, and none of it seemed to make Hervey look like a guy who had deep ties to the drug trafficking world. The detectives would still need to hear back from the FBI, but if Hervey had been working with a cartel, he'd managed to keep it pretty secret. So the detectives just kept pushing forward, talking to everyone they could who knew Hervey. And finally, just when they felt like they were running out of people to interview, the detectives did learn something very interesting. Hervey's roommate, Gabriel, was not just his roommate. Gabriel was Hervey's boyfriend. Now, Gabriel had not told the detectives this, and they couldn't believe that he had kept this a secret across the 2 interviews they had done with him. Having an intimate relationship with the victim immediately put Gabriel at the top of the suspect list, and the fact that he had lied about the relationship made him look even more suspicious. So, Knowles and Sanchez called Gabriel into the station for another interview. But when they confronted him, instead of him getting defensive or trying to deny it, Gabriel readily admitted that he and Hervey were indeed in a relationship. He told the detectives he was just a very private person and felt uncomfortable sharing those kinds of details. Sanchez and Knowles did not believe Gabriel, and they told him that because he had hid this information, they felt like he could be hiding something else. But Gabriel insisted he wasn't hiding anything. And then without any further prompting, he opened up about his and Hervey's relationship. Gabriel told them all about how he and Hervey had met, how at first they were good friends, and then they fell in love and moved in together. And after several minutes of this, when the detectives were finally able to steer the conversation back to the weeks leading up to the murder, Gabriel's story about Herbie's trip to Mexico and the phone calls he got didn't change at all. By the end of the interview, Knowles and Sanchez really didn't know what to think. Gabriel had clearly held back information from them about the relationship with Hervey, but when confronted, he told them all about it and then hadn't changed or embellished his story at all from that point forward. And also, they had already searched the apartment and there was no evidence that connected Gabriel to the crime. Not long after this meeting, things only seemed to get worse for the two detectives. The FBI came back to them and told them that after doing some digging, they found that Hervey's financial records did not show any connection to any drug cartels, or any other known criminals for that matter. Now, they still couldn't completely rule out the cartel's involvement in this murder, but for now at least, this lead felt like a dead end. By mid-April, so 3 months after Hervey's head had been found, the LAPD finally released Hervey's remains to his family so they could have a proper funeral. Knowles and Sanchez couldn't help but feel like they had let Hervey and his family down. They were no closer to finding the killer or killers than they had been on day one of the investigation. And in the weeks following the funeral, Knowles and Sanchez started to get assigned new cases that required immediate action. Hervey's murder was slowly becoming a cold case. Until one day in June, so now 5 months after Hervey's head had been found, Detective Knowles' phone rang, and he had one of the most bizarre conversations he'd had in all his time working in homicide. The caller introduced himself as an investigator with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. For a second, Knowles thought somebody might be prank calling him, because it was not every day an LA detective gets a call from a Canadian Mountie. But the Mountie quickly told Knowles that he'd been made aware of the case from back in January with the severed head and limbs. And the Mountie said they had actually just had a very similar case up in Quebec. A video had been uploaded to the internet that showed this naked man tied to a bed and another individual, dressed all in black, repeatedly stabbing him with an ice pick. And then once the man was dead, the killer dismembered the body before sexually abusing the body and cannibalizing some parts of it. And as if that wasn't brutal enough, the killer then sent other parts of the body to members of Canadian Parliament and several different elementary schools. Detective Knowles just sat there on the phone in silence. I mean, this was a totally brutal and horrible story, but he couldn't see any real connection to Hervey's murder, aside from both victims having been dismembered. But the Mountie continued and said they had actually already arrested this internet killer. And this man, who was a Canadian citizen named Luca Magnotta, was obsessed with Hollywood. He had recently lived in Los Angeles, not far from where Hervey lived, where he acted in porn movies and worked as a male escort before going back to Canada. But the big thing, the real reason the Mountie had called Knowles in the first place, was that while Luca was living in Los Angeles, he kept a blog in which he wrote about his exploits. And one of the things he wrote about was the dismembered body found in Bronson Canyon, Hervey's body. After the call with the Mountie, Knowles quickly met with Sanchez, and the detectives decided the first thing they needed to do was figure out exactly when Luca had been in the United States to see if maybe he could have actually crossed paths with Hervey in late December or January, the time they believed Hervey was killed. They reached out to the agencies in the US and Canada that maintain customs data, and they were able to find out when Luca actually crossed the border into the US and when he went back into Canada. Then they dug into Hervey's customs data to try to nail down the exact time he traveled to Mexico and if and when he came back to the States, in order to see if he and Luca had been in LA at the same time. But while they were looking into this, they discovered something that totally shocked them and made them rethink everything about this investigation. They came to realize that the reason the case had stalled out was because they had been operating under a false assumption the whole time. And after making this huge discovery, Knowles and Sanchez believed they had finally cracked the case. Based on all the evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Hervey Medellin. At around 3 a.m. on December 27, 2011, the killer crept through Hervey's apartment to the bedroom. The door was cracked open, and the killer looked in and saw Hervey sleeping inside. The killer threw the door open, rushed the bed, and jumped on top of him. Hervey immediately woke up and began yelling as the killer tried to cup their hands over Hervey's mouth to muffle his screams. Hervey kept fighting back, but the killer wrapped their hands around his throat and began to squeeze. Hervey continued to yell, so the killer squeezed harder and harder, and after about 5 minutes of this, Hervey stopped struggling. His face was blue and his eyes were empty. He was dead. The killer remained in Hervey's apartment, and a bit later that morning, they opened up Gabriel's computer and did a search. They pulled up an article titled "Butchering the Human Carcass for Consumption." This article provided detailed instructions on how to dismember a human body for the purpose of cooking and consuming it. Once the killer felt like they had a clear understanding of what to do, they went back to Hervey's bedroom and used a saw they had recently purchased to separate Hervey's head and limbs from his body. The killer then refrigerated those body parts for 3 weeks, but for reasons no one fully understands, the killer never actually consumed any of it. There was no cannibalism, despite clearly there being some level of interest based on that search that was done on Gabriel's computer on the night of the murder. And so 3 weeks after the murder, the killer walked through Bronson Canyon in the dark with Hervey's body parts and dug shallow graves at various spots and buried them. And soon after that, with Hervey now officially out of the picture, the killer was able to transfer all the money from Hervey's personal bank account into the joint bank account they had opened after they had moved in together. Gabriel Martinez murdered his boyfriend Hervey in the apartment they shared. It turned out that before Christmas of 2011, Gabriel and Hervey's relationship had started to completely fall apart. In fact, things had gotten so bad that Hervey told Gabriel he wanted to end things, and he said Gabriel should start looking for another place to live. Gabriel knew he would not be able to afford a Los Angeles apartment or lead the life he'd grown accustomed to on his own because he didn't have a steady income. He had become financially dependent on Hervey, and so, in his desperation, he had decided to kill Hervey and steal his money. On Christmas Day, when Hervey's friend Amelia came over, Gabriel sat on the couch with his laptop, Googling what tools to use to cut up a human body. Being Hervey's significant other and failing to disclose their relationship to police had made Gabriel a leading suspect early on, but police had found no clear evidence pointing to Gabriel or anyone else, so the case had gone cold. But it was the customs data that detectives obtained while following the lead on the Canadian internet killer, Luca Magnotta, that helped lead them back to Gabriel. Customs data showed that Luca had been in Canada at the time Hervey went missing, which ruled Luca out as the killer. But more importantly, this customs data made it clear that Hervey had never actually traveled or even booked a flight to Mexico at any time in late December or January. Gabriel had crafted this intricate lie about Hervey's trip, even providing phone records showing all the times Hervey had called him from Mexico. But once investigators knew Gabriel was lying, they dug deeper into his phone records and discovered the calls had actually come from Hervey's friend, who was calling Gabriel from Mexico, but they were doing so to find out why they had suddenly stopped hearing from Hervey. At this point, the detectives were sure Gabriel was the killer. But the final piece of evidence they would need to convince the district attorney would not be discovered until 2014, over 2 years after the murder. At that time, a city worker was digging in the ground not too far from where Hervey's head had been discovered, and he found a plastic bag containing pieces of decaying human flesh. A DNA sample of this flesh matched Hervey's DNA, but it was actually the bag itself that sealed Hervey's case, because this was a very specific type of bag, one that was used to protect and transport expensive paintings, and it matched those same types of bags that had been found in Hervey and Gabriel's apartment. Los Angeles detectives tracked Gabriel down in San Antonio, Texas, where he had married a wealthy woman who was supporting him, and with the help of local police, they arrested him. Gabriel was eventually found guilty of murder and sentenced to 25 years to life in prison. On Friday evening, September 1st, 1944, Aline Kearney curled up on the living room couch with her 2 young daughters and her nephew Roger at her home in Mattoon, Illinois. Aline had a picture book open on her lap, and the kids were all cuddled around her, listening to her tell a bedtime story. A warm breeze was blowing in through the open windows, and in the kitchen, she could hear her sister Martha making tea. Aline's husband, Bert, was out driving on his taxi route, so Aline had asked Martha and Roger to come keep her company. Aline was used to her husband's late-night taxi driving, but she still hated being home alone with the kids after dark, and she'd become even more afraid after the US entered World War II almost 3 years ago. She knew it was probably silly, but there were a lot of rumors about Nazi spies planning attacks on unsuspecting Americans. And so it just made Aline even more nervous. She constantly felt anxious, and so having company around helped her nerves a bit. Soon, the clock above the mantel chimed 11 p.m., and so they all headed for bed. Aline brought her 3-year-old daughter, Dorothy, along with her to her bedroom. Dorothy liked to sleep with Aline on the nights when Bert wasn't home. Meanwhile, Martha, Roger, and Aline's youngest daughter, Carol, stayed in the guest room across the hall. Aline helped Dorothy climb into bed, then she cracked open the window to let some warm evening air into the stuffy bedroom. After that, Aline crept under the covers as well, next to her daughter. But just as she was starting to doze off, Aline noticed the sickeningly sweet odor filling the bedroom. She sat upright and looked around the room for the source of the smell, but there was nothing obvious, so she figured it must be coming from the flower box she kept hanging right outside the window. So she laid back down and tried to go to sleep. However, as the minutes ticked by, the strange smell only grew stronger and more potent, and so eventually Aline got up and walked over to the bedroom window to get a better smell. But as she stood there, her legs suddenly felt really stiff, like she was becoming paralyzed. Aline called out for her sister, and seconds later, Martha burst in. Aline told her to please come over here and shut the bedroom window. Martha didn't understand what was going on, but immediately shut it. And then afterward, she reflexively began to wrinkle her nose at the strange smell that seemed to be making her sister sick. But before either could talk about the smell, Aline shrieked out that she could barely feel her legs. And so Martha ran to the kitchen telephone to call their neighbor for help. Aline was rattled. She grabbed little Dorothy, who was looking pretty shaken herself, and she carried her to the living room on her very shaky, stiff legs. Soon, she could hear police sirens drawing closer, and then a moment later, the neighbor ran in through the front door with a pair of police officers in tow. Aline told the officers that she wasn't sure what had just happened, but she was pretty sure she just suffered some kind of gas attack. She explained how her bedroom had suddenly filled with this weird, sickeningly sweet smell, and then her legs had stiffened up, and then luckily her sister had run in and shut the window and sort of stopped the symptoms from getting worse. The officers searched the property, but after about 20 minutes, they admitted that they had not found anything suspicious. They walked the perimeter of the house and the yard, but nothing seemed out of place, and so they had no clue what the smell was or what may have caused it. The officers did suggest that Aline go to the hospital and get checked out, but she said she was not about to do anything until her husband Bert got home. A few minutes later, around midnight, Bert received a call from his dispatcher about a possible chemical attack at his house. Instantly terrified, he wheeled his taxi around and raced toward home. All he could think of was Aline and his daughters. He turned onto his street and pulled up to his house. And at first, everything looked normal. The police had already left by this point, and just the family car was in the driveway. But as he got out of the taxi, Bert saw this figure, a tall man dressed in dark clothing with a tight-fitting cap, standing right outside the living room window. Bert stared at this guy in disbelief. The man seemed to be spying on his family. Bert shouted out, and the stranger tore off running into the alleyway behind the house. Bert dashed after him, sprinting down the side yard and across the back into the alleyway, but then he looked left and right, and the man was just gone. Bert wanted to catch his breath, but he didn't have time. Instead, he turned and ran back to his house. He went inside and made a beeline for the kitchen phone, all the while yelling out to his wife that he was home. Then Bert picked up the phone, called the police, and told them that somebody was prowling outside his house. An hour later, Bert stuffed a duffel bag into his car and held the passenger door open for Aline and his daughters. He'd already sent Martha and Roger home just to be safe. The police had arrived quickly and canvassed his property for the second time that evening, but they didn't find anyone matching his description of the strange prowler. They promised they would file a report right when they got back to the station, but Bert just hadn't felt good about anybody staying at the house right now. And so he decided to move his family to a relative's house across town. By this point, luckily, Aline had regained feeling in her legs, and so basically was back to normal. However, Aline and Bert's daughter, Dorothy, said she felt nauseous. And so the parents' plan was if she didn't feel better by morning, they would take her to the doctor, and they would also, while they were there, have Aline checked out as well. The following morning, Dorothy was still feeling sick, so Bert took his family to the hospital. And while they waited for a doctor to see Aline and Dorothy, Bert paced around the waiting room and eventually grabbed a copy of the local paper, the Journal-Gazette. And when Bert saw the front page headline, he was shocked. It read, "Anesthetic Prowler on the Loose." Bert read that the authorities suspected that his daughter and his wife had been attacked with some kind of anesthetic gas. They were being called the Prowler's first victims, and the Prowler, the police believed, was the person that Bert had seen looking in his window when he had come back home. The article said the Mattoon police were working hard to find this mysterious stranger and apprehend him because they believed he had access to poison gas and would continue to do this to other people. Now, Bert knew, clearly something bad had happened at his house the night before, between whatever happened to his wife and daughter and then seeing that person outside, but at no point had he ever really suspected that his family was being poisoned. And so the idea that that's what police thought was going on here was terrifying. He realized that his family was lucky to be alive. Three days later, 46-year-old Beulah Cordes and her husband Carl got home after a nice dinner out. They'd spent the whole evening talking about the so-called Mattoon gasser. At least that's what the neighbors were calling the suspected prowler. Beulah knew the situation was serious, but things like this never happened in Mattoon. So she and Carl let themselves get a bit carried away with all the gossip. But now, Beulah was ready to unwind and relax a bit before bed. They came in through the back door, then kicked off their shoes and headed to the living room. Beulah sat down in her usual chair while Carl flicked on the radio. And Beulah had just gotten comfortable when she noticed something small and white stuck in the screen of their front door. Curious, she crossed the room and grabbed it. It was a white rag about the size of a dish towel, and there was a large wet spot right in the center of it. And without thinking, Beulah raised the rag to her nose and sniffed in to see if she could figure out what the spot was. The moment she inhaled, she knew it was a mistake. A feeling like an electric current raced down her body and began to tingle her feet. Then her knees began to shake like electricity was coursing through them too. Beulah shrieked, and as soon as she did, she felt this deep burning sensation in her throat. And that burning sensation traveled up to her mouth, and before long she could feel her lips swelling, and that made her scream even louder. Carl came running over and asked her what was going on, but she couldn't form words to explain what was happening. She tried to take a breath, but as soon as she did, she felt something rising in her throat. And so she ran to the kitchen and leaned over the sink to spit out whatever was in her throat. But when she did, it was bright red. She was coughing up blood. Seconds later, Carl was on the phone with the doctor. Beulah was stretched out on the sofa by the time her physician, Dr. Bailey, arrived to examine her. She sat up and thanked him for racing over so quickly. Dr. Bailey checked her vitals and asked her about her symptoms. He also put on a face mask so he could safely take a look at the rag Beulah had found in her screen door. Beulah just watched as her doctor held up the rag and turned it over in his hand. Finally, Dr. Bailey said that he couldn't say for sure, but the rag had the sweet scent of chloroform, an anesthetic sometimes used during surgery. But he explained that when it's inhaled in high concentrations, it can irritate the nose and throat, it can interfere with coordination, and cause waves of nausea. Beulah instantly felt like that was exactly what she experienced, like it must have been chloroform. However, she and Carl did not keep chloroform in their house. A chill ran through Beulah as she realized that she must have been the newest victim of the mad gasser. She told her husband to call the police. Within minutes, a police car pulled into the driveway outside of Beulah's house, and a pair of officers came to the front door. Carl let them in and showed them the toxic rag that Beulah had found. Beulah watched from the couch as the officers began to search their house. She was feeling better, her stomach had calmed down, and the electric current sensation had finally left her body. Her lips were still swollen, but she'd stopped spitting up blood. More than anything, she was just rattled, knowing the Mattoon gasser had been on her doorstep. After police searched the inside of the house, they made their way out to the front porch. And a couple of minutes later, one of the officers came back inside carrying a thin silver key, as well as an empty tube of lipstick. The officer asked if the items belonged to them, but Beulah shook her head and said no. Someone must have left them on her porch. Eventually, the police left to go canvass the neighborhood. It was clear to Beulah that an unwelcome visitor had been on their porch, very likely the Mattoon gasser, and that they had clearly wanted to hurt them. And so Beulah did not feel safe in her own home. And if she really had been poisoned with chloroform, she felt like she should probably go to the hospital and get checked out. But just a few minutes later, Beulah saw the police coming back down the sidewalk, and this time, with them, was a man in handcuffs. Beulah immediately walked over to the window to get a better look, and while she couldn't make out the man's features, she could tell he was tall and slim, and so he fit the description of the Mattoon gasser. After the police stuffed the man into the back of their patrol car and drove off, Beulah suddenly felt relieved. She hoped they just caught the mad gasser of Mattoon. "5 days later, Mattoon Chief of Police C.E. Cole rode shotgun in a police car alongside a fellow investigator. He was on his way to search an abandoned home on the outskirts of town, which he thought might be a potential hideout for the anesthetic prowler, or the mad gasser, as the papers were calling him now. Earlier that week, 2 of his officers had arrested a suspect, a man they'd found loitering down the road from Beulah Cortez's home. However, after questioning him, they realized that this man had simply been at the wrong place at the wrong time. He was only on that block because he was lost and trying to figure out his way home. So Chief Cole had released him, which meant they were back to looking for the real mad gasser. The Journal-Gazette had been reporting on this story nonstop, keeping all of Mattoon on edge, and the chief was feeling tremendous pressure to catch this attacker. Over the past few days, 5 more people had reached out to the police and to the papers, saying that they'd also been victims of the mad gasser. One couple said they were attacked the night before Aline Kearney. Another victim was a local fortune teller who said she even saw the perpetrator, but she described him as big with muscular arms that didn't match the description that Bert Kearney had given of the tall man standing outside his home. Chief Cole also noticed that the method of poisoning changed with each victim, which felt unusual to him. For instance, it seemed like the gas had been pumped through Aline Kearney's window, while the chloroform cloth had been left on Beulah Cortez's front door. The chief wasn't sure what to make of that, but in the meantime, the citizens of Mattoon were not taking any chances. Everyone was on high alert. The police car came to a stop outside of a corner store. On the sidewalk out front, a small group of men in their 30s were leaning on baseball bats as they smoked cigarettes. One of the men kept looking up and down the street. Cole realized they were a neighborhood patrol. He'd heard that a lot of men were walking their neighborhoods at night with baseball bats, trying to keep their homes safe. The chief got out of the car and headed into the store and grabbed a couple of sodas and some batteries for his flashlight. When he got to the register, he glanced over at the newspaper rack that held the daily paper. The headline made him wince. Mattoon's Journal-Gazette had printed yet another story on potential attacks that had happened that week. It said that 2 women had already been hospitalized and 5 more people had fallen ill. And the article was clearly full of criticism about how the city, and specifically the police, were mishandling the case. Chief Cole begrudgingly grabbed a copy of the paper and told the clerk to add it to his total. When he got back to the car, he showed the paper to his fellow officer, and he read one section aloud. It said that Mattoon police were too proud to share all the facts with the public, and sometimes denied that crimes had occurred altogether. Cole had never read a bigger lie in his life. As they drove through town, the chief saw more men sitting out on their front porches, shotguns across their laps. It was like they were daring the mad gasser to trespass. Cole had also heard that women had begun carrying golf clubs with them whenever they left the house. The whole city was terrified, and the chief knew it was up to him to close this case fast. Cole knew they were nearing the edge of town when the stench of burning diesel fuel hit his nostrils. Most of the industrial plants were out this way, including a diesel engine manufacturing plant that employed about 500 of Mattoon's residents. On a windy day, the whole town could smell like these factories. Eventually, they pulled up to a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town that the chief suspected could be the gasser's hideout. It looked like nobody had lived there for years. Cole and his fellow officer began searching the outside of the property, but nothing seemed out of place. So he walked up the rickety steps to the front door and pushed on it. And it didn't take much pushing to wrench the door wide open. Inside, the house was covered in a thick layer of dust. Chief Cole and the other officer split up and began searching the house. While the other officer quietly tiptoed upstairs, the chief found the door to the basement and began going down these steep, narrow steps. When Cole reached the bottom, the basement was pitch black, except for a little light that filtered in through a dirty window. The chief clicked on his flashlight so he could see into all the dark corners. The basement was like a cement box and smelled like mold. The chief half expected to find some kind of makeshift laboratory down here, or maybe even the gasser himself mixing up different chloroform weapons. But there was nothing. Just a dank, dusty basement. Not even a set of footprints along the floor. The house wound up being completely clear. It was obvious nobody had been in the structure for years. And so by the time Cole and his partner were back out in the car, Cole realized he had zero leads on who the mad gasser was and where he was hiding. The following evening, Chief Cole arrived at the station to find 5 squad cars from the Illinois State Police parked outside. He'd asked for their help after he had searched that abandoned house and found nothing. He hoped they wouldn't have to stay for too long, but for now, he needed their help. Chief Cole went inside the station and made his way right to his office, where he sat down in his seat. Then he flicked on the radio and poured himself a glass of whiskey. Once the evening news started, as expected, the mad gasser of Mattoon was their main story. However, tonight, instead of just updating the public on details of the attacks, the announcer would also be reading a statement that Chief Cole had issued that afternoon. Chief Cole smiled to himself, confident that this entire fiasco would soon come to an end. All day, his team and the state police had been interviewing people non-stop, anyone they felt might be connected to the case. But nobody emerged as a viable suspect. And that's when the chief started thinking, and a new theory came to him. So after lunch, he'd taken another trip to the outskirts of town. And as he was driving by the manufacturing plants, a strong breeze had filled his car with this odd, sweet smell. It was coming from the Atlas Imperial Diesel Engine Company. Cole had done some investigating and learned that recently, Atlas had begun making supplies for the soldiers overseas. And to make some of these supplies, they used a large amount of carbon tetrachloride, a clear, non-flammable liquid that produced a sweet odor when it evaporated. It also smelled a lot like chloroform. To Chief Cole, it was now clear to him that there was no mad gasser. Instead, the balmy late summer breeze had been carrying this chemical vapor into town and causing all these illnesses. So he'd asked all the local radio stations to read his statement, laying out his findings. And Chief Cole hoped that after everyone heard it, they would finally have peace of mind. And sure enough, at some point, the radio announcer did read the statement. And at the end of it, he laid out Cole's simple fix for the so-called gas attacks. Basically, all people had to do was simply close their windows at night, and they would be okay. When the broadcast finally ended, Chief Cole turned off the radio and left his office feeling better than he had in days. But that good feeling lasted less than 12 hours. The next morning, Chief Cole was once again feeling very stressed as he shook hands with 2 physicians at Mattoon's Memorial Hospital. Overnight, his confidence in having solved the case was shaken. The Atlas Diesel Company had released a statement of their own, pointing out a flaw in Chief Cole's theory. None of their plant workers, who spent all day surrounded by those fumes, had ever gotten sick from the carbon tetrachloride. So there was no way the tetrachloride was responsible for poisoning people in town. Chief Cole knew that if the factory fumes weren't causing the problem, well, then realistically, there might be a mad gasser, and his investigation would be back at square one. And he needed answers fast, because by this point, at least 7 households had been targeted by the mad gasser. People were calling the police department with all kinds of leads, and the newspaper had been reporting on the attacks daily. If he didn't figure this out soon, he could have a riot on his hands. So, Cole had called a meeting with the doctors who were treating the latest victims to see if they had found any medical evidence to help him figure out what was going on here. And when Chief Cole spoke to the physicians, something immediately stood out to him. All the victims had already been sent home. But as the doctors explained their reasoning for sending people home, Cole began to understand why. He started to remember small details about each of the poisonings, inconsistencies that he'd ignored at the time. But now they were fitting together and painting a very different picture of what could be going on here. Despite the chief's embarrassment over yesterday's radio broadcast where his statement was read and was so clearly wrong, Cole realized he did need to speak out again, this time directly to the public. It was time to call a press conference. Later that day, on September 12, 1944, Chief Cole and the Mattoon Commissioner of Public Health stood together in front of City Hall. Several journalists and concerned citizens spread out on the steps below them, clearly anticipating a big announcement around the mad gasser. The commissioner began his speech, saying that sooner or later, this mad gasser frenzy was going to get someone killed. But they weren't going to die from a gas attack. Because there was no mad gasser of Mattoon, just like Chief Cole thought. However, Chief Cole did not have everything right when he first came out with that public address on the radio. When Chief Cole met with the doctors at the hospital, they told him that they had ran tests on the people who had supposedly been attacked by the gasser. But these tests showed no evidence of poison gas or any other chemical in their stomachs or their blood. In fact, all of the victims were perfectly healthy. The only way the doctors could explain this was to conclude that there never was a gas attack at all. They agreed their victims had truly suffered from something, but what they suffered from was extreme nervous tension. The mad gasser of Mattoon was actually a case of mass hysteria. Mattoon had been enduring wartime deprivations for years. Half of the men in town were fighting overseas in World War II, and every day the papers ran stories about the war and hometown soldiers who had died. The entire town was afraid and anxious. Aline Kearney, the first victim, was intensely afraid of being alone in her home at night. It's possible that stress and anxiety created physical symptoms like nausea and dizziness. When Beulah Cordes, the second victim, saw a rag in her door, it's likely she remembered Aline's story about poison gas, and then her body sort of unconsciously mimicked Aline's symptoms after she smelled it. And once Aline and Beulah's stories got out, more people just began thinking they'd been poisoned too. And it sort of made sense, because suddenly normal symptoms like getting a headache or feeling a little bit dizzy and some fatigue quickly became symptoms of a gas attack, and only added to the rumors about a malevolent stranger prowling the streets of Mattoon. And remember, the whole town had heard about how Bert had come home, shortly after the gas attack on Aline, and he saw that guy standing outside his house looking in the window, and he chased him off into the alleyway. They never caught that guy, but he quickly became sort of like the boogeyman. He was the mad gasser, and it sort of solidified this idea that this was a real thing, that somebody was literally targeting people in this town with poisonous gas. However, once the media began reporting on the mass hysteria theory, the police did not receive any more phone calls about gas attacks. Sociologists now use Mattoon, Illinois, as the textbook example of mass psychogenic illness, where fear itself can fuel physical symptoms that can quickly spread through an entire community. Also, local media can play a large role in shaping and amplifying these narratives. There are still some who believe that Aline and Beulah might have been genuine victims of a prowler who maybe attacked them with gas, who who then skipped town once the media started reporting on his attacks. And then from there, maybe the 5 additional victims were actually suffering from mass hysteria. But there's no way to know for sure what truly happened. And so for now, the evidence suggests it was all just in their heads.
On the evening of December 20th, 2022, a young woman named Moon Soo-ho, along with her boyfriend, whose name was Lee Ki-young, sat at a table at a Korean barbecue restaurant in northern Seoul, which is the capital city of South Korea. The couple didn't even have any food yet, but Moon was not even looking at the menu. Instead, she was excitedly checking her watch, waiting for her parents to arrive. This dinner was a very special occasion for Moon because she had been dating Lee for several months now and she was totally in love with him, but she had not introduced him to her parents yet. And so Lee had surprised her with reservations to this restaurant tonight for 4 people. He had invited her parents to come to the dinner so they could all finally meet. Moon looked across the table at Lee and she smiled because she knew as soon as her parents saw this guy, they were going to be impressed. Lee was a 32-year-old Army veteran with lots of crazy stories from his time in the military. He was also exceptionally good-looking, he was very well educated, and he came from a family that was extremely successful and very wealthy. Lee's grandfather owned the high-rise building that Lee was staying in. I mean, this family was very influential and powerful in South Korea. But Lee was not full of himself. He was very humble, he was kind and polite, and he had a total soft spot for little animals. He had adopted a dog and 3 cats and adored them. I mean, this was a guy who was kind of like the total package that any parent would be psyched that their daughter was dating. After Moon and Lee had been sitting at this table for about 15 minutes, Moon looked up and she saw her parents finally coming in the door. And so Moon, she stood up and she waved to her parents and flagged them over to the table. And so they came over, they said hi to Lee. And right away, Lee, he picked up the menu and he ordered all these very expensive drinks and all the expensive meats on the menu. And then before long, Lee was chatting with Moon's father about his military service. And then Lee was talking to Moon's mother and showing her pictures of his dog and his 3 cats. And Moon, she was just sitting back enjoying watching this because she could see from her parents' facial expressions that they seemed to really like Lee too. And so this night was going as good as it could have. Moon and Lee and Moon's parents stayed at this restaurant for at least 2 hours, just enjoying each other's company and throwing back a lot of drinks and eating expensive food. And by the end of the night, when the parents got up to leave, they were like hugging Lee and slapping him on the back and telling him how great he was. And Lee was doing the same thing to the parents. It was like really they had hit it off. But after Moon's parents were gone, Moon and Lee, they left the restaurant too, and they began walking across the street towards the parking garage where Lee had parked. And right away, Moon could tell Lee was actually pretty drunk. She had not noticed it in the restaurant, but now she could see Lee was kind of stumbling a little bit. But Moon wasn't upset about this. If anything, she just thought, wow, he was so composed talking to my parents in there, despite obviously being drunk. He had just managed to mask it really, really well. But despite how impressed she was with her boyfriend, Moon didn't want Lee to drive them home. It seemed like that would be really unsafe to do because, again, obviously he is drunk. And so when Lee and Moon made it to Lee's car, Moon kind of gently told Lee, hey, why don't we leave your car here and just call a taxi and they can take us home safely. But when she said this, Lee took it as if Moon was criticizing him for being too drunk. And he felt really offended because in his mind, he had just put on this great date and made this great first impression on Moon's parents. And here she is kind of nagging him. And so Lee just kind of blew his lid and the couple got in this horrible yelling fight in the parking garage, which ended with Lee telling Moon that their relationship was now over, and then Lee turned around and stormed off to hail a cab by himself. And after he was gone, Moon just stood there next to Lee's car being totally shocked at what had just happened, and then kind of in a daze, she went and hailed a cab herself and went home, and then she just laid in bed and cried until she went to sleep. But Moon was not heartbroken for long because the next morning when Moon woke up, she heard a knock on the front door, and when she opened it up, there was a delivery guy with this huge, beautiful bouquet of roses for Moon. And so Moon took these roses and quickly found a card attached to the roses. She opened it up and there was a letter from Lee saying, please accept these roses as a part of my apology. Last night didn't go so well. I'm really sorry. Please come to dinner with me tonight. Moon was so relieved to get this apology letter that she called Lee right away and said, you know what, I do forgive you. It's all water under the bridge. You know, my parents, they loved you and they have no idea about that fight we had. So let's just put it behind us and just continue being boyfriend and girlfriend. And at this point, it was Lee's turn to be totally relieved because he didn't know if Moon would want him back. But they were back together, and that night they went out for a fancy dinner together, and then also Lee had booked a very fancy hotel room that night for them to stay in. And this is really how their relationship went for the next couple of days. Basically, Lee would take Moon out shopping anywhere she wanted to go. They went to all the best restaurants and stayed in the best hotels. To Moon, it was obvious that Lee was really just continuing to shower her with gifts and praise and all these fun things to still try to make up for that big fight they got into, even though Moon really had forgiven him. And at some point, after several days of being treated like a princess by Lee, Moon finally told Lee, stop buying me stuff, it's fine, I totally forgive you, everything is good. But Lee insisted that he be allowed to continue to spoil her. After all, it was the Christmas season, and she deserved to be spoiled around Christmas. So in South Korea, Christmas is celebrated a bit differently than it is in Western countries like America. In South Korea, Christmas is a big holiday, but it's really just a holiday for couples. It's not really a family occasion. So in South Korea, on Christmas, lots of couples will go out on these fancy dates, and so that's kind of how they celebrate Christmas. Whereas, you know, in Western countries like America, it's all about family and waking up and getting presents from Santa Claus. So that's the difference. Western is family-centric, and in South Korea, it's very couple-centric. It's kind of like Valentine's Day in the winter. So, on Christmas Eve, Lee told Moon that he had a very special dinner planned for Christmas, and would Moon mind coming over to Lee's apartment on Christmas morning to feed his cats and his dog, because Lee was going to be out running errands in preparation for this big Christmas dinner. And of course, Moon said she would. So, at around 11 a.m. on Christmas Day, Moon hopped off the elevator inside of Lee's apartment building and began walking down the hall towards his door, carrying the key to his door. But as Moon walked closer and closer to Lee's door, she began smelling this really powerful smell. It smelled like roses. And for a second, Moon thought to herself, oh my goodness, this whole thing was a setup. I'm not here to feed his pets. I'm here because he must have planned some really elaborate thing for Christmas Day for right now. And probably it has to do with lots of roses inside of his apartment. And so Moon was really excited by the time she got out front of Lee's apartment door. But before she used her key to open it up and just go in, she decided she would just call out for Lee, because she figured at this point, he's got to be in there. He knows I'm about to be surprised by this big thing. And so she calls out for Lee, but there's no answer. And so she knocks a couple of times to see if maybe she can get Lee to come to the door, but after knocking several times, there was no answer. So eventually, Moon used her key, she opened up the door, swung it open, and she stepped inside of Lee's apartment, expecting to be wowed by whatever Lee had planned. But instead, when she looked around, she couldn't really understand what she was even seeing. Lee was nowhere to be found, but there were roses all over the apartment. However, these were not new roses. These were like several days old. Many of them were wilted and the petals were starting to fall off, and the water that all these roses were sitting in was very dirty. But really, there were like vases of roses everywhere on every surface. And right away, Moon started to feel really uneasy. It was like very creepy to be in this dark apartment where no one's inside of, with just these weird flowers everywhere. And so without going any further into the apartment, Moon once again yelled out for Lee in hopes that maybe he was here, but again, he didn't come out of any of the rooms, so she knows she's alone. And so she called Lee on his phone to try to get an explanation for what she was looking at. But Lee didn't answer his phone. By this point, Lee's 3 cats were circling around Moon's legs because they were eager to be fed, and so Moon kind of stopped thinking about this strange flower situation and looked over at the cats' bowls and saw there was no dry food. They had eaten all of their food. And so Moon began walking over to the bowls when she realized Lee had not told her where he kept the cat food, and so she had no idea where it was. So Moon began opening all the kitchen cabinets, hoping to find this cat food somewhere, but she didn't, and so eventually she left the kitchen and she walked down this hallway inside of the apartment, and she found there was a skinny closet in the hallway that looked like a place where you would store cleaning supplies and vacuums and that sort of thing. So she reached down and tried to open it. But she was able to turn the doorknob, but there was something inside of this closet that was making it really hard to open, like it was stuck on something. Now, again, Moon is kind of looking around this dark, dingy apartment that's filled with all these wilted roses, and she's feeling super uneasy, but she thought, I just want to feed these cats and just get out of here. And so Moon just grabbed that door handle and yanked as hard as she could, and she managed to pop it open. And for a second, Moon just stared at the inside of the closet, having no idea what she was even looking at. And then she started to scream. One of the most terrifying places in the entire world is a place called Skinwalker Ranch in Utah. There have been so many unexplained occurrences on this property that government agencies have been sent to this ranch to basically do an investigation, and a lot of what they found is classified. I actually covered the Skinwalker Ranch story early on in my YouTube career, but the reason I covered it is because I watched another video which was way better than mine. It would turn out virtually everything Moon thought she knew about Lee, her boyfriend, was wrong. 5 days earlier, after Moon and Lee had gotten into that horrible fight in the parking garage following the dinner with Moon's parents, Lee had made it seem like he was storming off to go hail a cab and drive home on his own. But in reality, after he stormed off, he waited for Moon to walk away and get a cab on her own, and then Lee just walked right back over to where he had parked his car in the parking garage. He got inside, turned it on, and began driving home. But on his drive home, he actually crashed into a taxi driver. Now, neither Lee nor the taxi driver were harmed in this accident, and both cars were still drivable, but Lee actually had a really big problem with drinking and driving. 9 years earlier, in 2013, when Lee was serving in the military, he was put in military prison for drunk driving. And then after he got out of the military, he was arrested 2 more times for drunk driving in 2018 and 2019. And so even though this accident with the taxi driver was very minor, Lee did not want to go to police and report this accident, because if officials got involved, they would see that Lee has this horrible history of drunk driving and he would get in way more trouble. And so Lee convinced the taxi driver to just allow him to pay him privately for the damages in order to avoid getting officials involved. However, the taxi driver, who was open to this, demanded that Lee pay him in cash. He didn't want some sort of deferred payment plan. He wanted to be paid now. And so Lee said, okay, well then let's go to my apartment and I'll just pay you there. However, when the taxi driver and Lee got to Lee's apartment, they got in a fight over how much money Lee actually needed to pay the taxi driver for the damages. And eventually, Lee just kind of snapped and beat the taxi driver to death, and then stuffed his body inside of that cleaning closet in his apartment's hallway. And so that's what Moon had seen when she had opened up that closet. She saw the corpse of the taxi driver. And then after Lee had murdered the taxi driver, he stole the taxi driver's credit cards and his cell phone, and Lee would use the taxi driver's credit card to pay for all those lavish dinners and hotel stays and gifts over the next few days as Lee spoiled Moon for Christmas. And also during that time, Lee was using the taxi driver's cell phone to send messages to the taxi driver's family to convince them that he was still alive. Also, Lee went out and bought a whole bunch of bouquets of roses and put them all over his apartment to try to mask the smell of the rotting corpse inside of his closet. But this murder and Lee's horrible drunk driving were not his only secrets. Lee claimed he was from this very wealthy, successful family that owned all these amazing high-rises in South Korea, but that was all a big lie. Lee was not from a very successful family. He did not have any money. He basically just borrowed money from family and friends and then lied about how he acquired the money, claiming he was this big, successful, wealthy guy. Also, when the police in South Korea began investigating the taxi driver's murder, they discovered that Lee's apartment was not even his. It belonged to his ex-girlfriend, who was a bartender in South Korea who was in her 50s. Also, Lee's beloved 3 cats and dog that he talked about all the time, about how much he loved them and cared for them, well, those weren't his either. Those were his ex-girlfriend's. And as police continued their investigation into the murder of this taxi driver, they would eventually find traces of Lee's ex-girlfriend's blood inside of Lee's apartment, so his ex-girlfriend's apartment. And they would discover that Lee had murdered his ex-girlfriend, stolen her apartment, stolen her pets, and even took her cell phone, and to this day had been sending messages to her family to try to convince them that she was still alive, even though nobody had seen her and had no idea what was going on with her. Lee was ultimately arrested for 2 counts of murder, and he would quickly admit that he did kill the taxi driver and his ex-girlfriend. However, by this point, police had located the cell phone of a missing woman amongst Lee's things, and so they became very suspicious that he might have had something to do with this third woman's disappearance. However, to this day, Lee has denied having anything to do with this missing woman, and they still have no idea what happened to her, and so that case is kind of on hold. Despite how totally crazy this whole story sounds, the craziest part actually happened after Lee was arrested. Once Lee's crimes were being talked about all over the news, Lee became totally famous in South Korea because he was exceptionally good looking. On the news, they would play CCTV footage of Lee interacting with that taxi driver before he murdered him, and the only takeaway from lots of people in South Korea was, wow, this guy is so unbelievably attractive, he looks like an actor, not, here's a guy who's about to murder someone. In fact, Lee became so popular in South Korea for being so beautiful that there became a real fear that Lee's ex-girlfriend, Moon, would become a target in some way, that maybe Lee's fans would blame her for putting their beloved Lee in prison and they might try to attack her. However, the police in South Korea did a really good job of masking Moon's identity, and so to this day, we believe she is still safe. And also, for clarity, Moon is actually not her real name. That is a pseudonym that we used to protect her identity as well. In the end, Lee was sentenced to life in prison for those 2 murders. In the early evening of January 23rd, 1897, a blacksmith named Erasmus Shue stoked his fire inside of his little shop in rural West Virginia and then called out to his 11-year-old helper who was in the back cleaning up. Erasmus had been planning to head home early that night. However, a last-minute order for horseshoes had just come in, and so Erasmus knew that was not going to happen. He was going to have to work late. And so he was calling for his helper to send the helper to his home, Erasmus's home, to check on Erasmus's wife, Zona. He wanted to make sure that 1, Zona knew he would be late, and 2, if Zona needed anything, the helper could go out and get it for her or help around the house or whatever she needed. After the helper had left, Erasmus went back to poking at his fire, but his mind was not on the horseshoes he needed to make. Instead, it was on his wife, Zona. The couple hadn't told anyone yet, but Zona was pregnant. Erasmus and Zona had only just met a couple of months earlier, but they had fallen in love very quickly. Zona was 23 years old, and she had beautiful dark hair and dark eyes and a quick sense of humor. She was a total free spirit who had grown up on a farm, and she had never really been away from home. When Erasmus had arrived in the little village called Livesey's Mill, which was located near a river at the foot of this mountain and was right near where Zona lived, he and Zona had noticed each other right away. Erasmus, who was quite a bit older than Zona, he was 35 years old, was tall and handsome with piercing blue eyes, and he had come to this little rural town to set up his blacksmith shop. And to Zona, he was like this amazing, new, exciting thing. Zona's family, especially her mother, Mary Jane, did not approve of the fact that Zona and Erasmus had begun seeing each other, mostly because Mary Jane didn't like the fact that Erasmus was so much older than Zona, but Zona was known for being incredibly stubborn, and she loved Erasmus, and so there was just no stopping her. So, in November, just a couple of months after meeting each other, Zona and Erasmus got married and they moved into a little house together, and very quickly, Zona got pregnant. And both she and Erasmus were so excited about this that they wanted to go around and tell people, but early on, it was clear Zona had some complications with this pregnancy. She was sick all the time, and she just seemed really unwell, and the doctor who was seeing her knew that it likely had to do with her pregnancy. And so the couple decided that they should just wait and let the pregnancy develop a bit before announcing the news. So, on this late January day, Erasmus began hustling to finish these horseshoes because he really wanted to get home and be there for Zona and make sure she really was okay. And so as Erasmus thought about Zona, the steel he was heating inside of this fire was glowing bright orange and was ready to be forged into shape. And so Erasmus got his hammer and he got to work. Meanwhile, Erasmus's 11-year-old helper had arrived at Erasmus and Zona's house, and the helper walked through the gate up to the front door of this little 2-story home, and he knocked on the front door. But Zona did not come to the door, which the helper thought was odd, because Zona was someone who was always bustling around the home and was very quick to open the door and chat with neighbors. And now, standing in front of this door, the helper couldn't even hear a sound inside of the house. It was like no one was home. And so the helper knocked again, and after some more silence, he just reached down and tried the doorknob and found it was unlocked, and so he swung the door in. And right away, the helper noticed that the house was totally dark. None of the lamps were lit, even though the sun was setting fast. And so the helper stepped inside of the house and continued to call out for Mrs. Shu, but there was no answer. And at some point, as the helper turned a corner and looked towards the base of the stairs that led up to the second level, he froze. Because lying on the ground was Zona. She was lying perpendicular to how the stairs run, on her back with one arm over her chest, like she was sleeping at the foot of the stairs. And so at this point, the helper is scared. He doesn't know what's going on here. Obviously something is wrong. And so very slowly, the helper began moving closer and closer to Zona. And when he was practically right on top of her, he yelled out her name one more time. And when she didn't call back and her chest wasn't moving and she was just totally still, he knew, obviously, something was terribly wrong. And so the helper at this point turned around and sprinted out of the house and ran back to his own house. And when he got there, he ran inside and he told his mother that he thought Mrs. Shu, Zona, was dead. And so the mother told the helper, run back to the blacksmith shop and tell Erasmus to go home right now. I'll get the doctor. It would take the local doctor, the same one who had been treating Zona for her pregnancy complications, almost an hour to finally get to Zona's house. And when the doctor arrived, he found the 11-year-old helper and his mother and other neighbors kind of clustered around in the first floor of the home. And then when he went up to the second floor into the master bedroom, he found Erasmus, who by this point had returned, and he was sitting on his bed, and he had laid out his wife, Zona, so that she was on her back and her head was in his arms, and he was stroking her hair and rocking back and forth and crying. The doctor, of course, knew Zona and Erasmus very well because of how often he had been treating Zona for her pregnancy issues over these last few weeks, and so he felt a pit of sadness looking at this scene, but he knew he had to do his job, and so he gently walked over and he put his hand on Erasmus's shoulder, and he just said, I need to examine Zona's body. And Erasmus, at this point, he didn't even look up. He just continued to sob and rock back and forth while stroking her hair. Finally, the doctor kind of was a bit more forceful in asking Erasmus to step aside, at which point Erasmus did. He got out of the way and positioned Zona flat on the bed, and he made sure her hair was perfectly combed all around her neck. And then Erasmus knelt down right next to the bed and continued stroking his wife's hair and crying, while the doctor at this point kind of moved to the foot of the bed and began looking at Zona and beginning his examination. And the doctor would quickly confirm that yes, Zona was dead. And after looking at her pelvis and kind of moving her around, the doctor came to the conclusion that very likely Zona had passed away from pregnancy complications. Zona's funeral would be held the next day at the local cemetery at the top of this hilltop. And by this point, the word had gotten out that Zona had been pregnant when she died. And so during this funeral, everybody was staring at Erasmus, who was overcome with grief and crying so hard that he could barely catch his breath. And then right before they lowered Zona's casket into the ground, Erasmus made a point of putting his wife's favorite scarf into the coffin with her. He said his final goodbyes, he shut the casket, and then it was lowered into the ground. But while the mourners were obviously very moved by just how unbelievably grief-stricken Erasmus was, his whole family was wiped out in one blow, what really stood out to the people that attended that funeral was not Erasmus's reaction to his wife's death, but rather Zona's mother's reaction to Erasmus. During this funeral, Mary Jane, Zona's mother, didn't seem sad or grief-stricken or in any way reacting to the fact that her daughter had died. Instead, as the funeral went on, Mary Jane shamelessly glared at Erasmus with a look of pure hate and disgust on her face. And then, after the funeral was over, all the mourners wanted to go up to Mary Jane and Erasmus to pay their final respects to the family, but Mary Jane ignored all these people and promptly left the funeral without saying a word to anyone. And in the days that followed Zona's funeral, Mary Jane's behavior only continued to get more and more bizarre. When neighbors would drop by Mary Jane's house to drop off food or just check in on her, Mary Jane refused to come to the door. Mary Jane basically began staying up all night. People would see there were candles lit in her bedroom at all hours, and they'd see her pacing around her room and then periodically kneeling on the ground and kind of staring off into the distance. And then on the rare occasion that Mary Jane actually left her house, she would look totally disheveled and distracted, and as she walked around town, she'd be mumbling under her breath and constantly looking over her shoulder like she was scared someone was following her. And when concerned neighbors came up to Mary when she was out of her house, she refused to make eye contact with them, didn't want to talk to them, and as fast as she could would get away from them. Whatever was going on with Mary Jane, her husband was not willing to talk about it to other people in town. However, they did notice that he had begun sleeping in the barn, so he was not even staying in the house with his wife. And then, on the morning of February 21st, so about a month after Zona had died, Mary Jane walked out of her house looking totally clean-cut. She was not disheveled. She was not looking over her shoulder. She wasn't muttering to herself. She was standing tall, moving with a purpose, looking totally coherent. And as she moved, the only emotion people could see on her face was anger. And so Mary Jane, angrily, walking with a purpose, walked her way to the local prosecutor's office, and instead of knocking and waiting to be let inside, she just opened the door and barged right inside. The prosecutor knew Mary Jane and knew how strange she had been acting over these last few weeks, and so when she came inside, he was alarmed at her sudden presence, but he was also pretty curious as to what was going on. And so when she came in and demanded to speak to him, he was happy to go into his office and take a meeting kind of simply out of curiosity. But once the two of them sat down in his office, Mary Jane proceeded to tell this prosecutor this totally outlandish story about her dead daughter, Zona, that at first made the prosecutor think, okay, clearly Mary Jane has lost her mind. That's what's been going on over the past few weeks. All this grief of losing her daughter has caused her to kind of snap. But by the end of these 2 hours that Mary Jane seemed to just be kind of rambling about this story about her daughter, the prosecutor started to realize that what she was saying kind of made a lot of sense, and his suspicions began to rise and rise. And so once Mary Jane was done telling this wild story about Zona, the prosecutor was convinced that what Mary Jane was saying had to be true, and so he knew they needed to dig Zona up. And so after Mary Jane had left, the prosecutor ran to the local doctor's house, the same doctor who had been treating Zona and then also looked at her after she died. And the prosecutor would tell the doctor that, hey, we need to exhume Zona and you need to examine her again. And the doctor at first was like, wait a minute, what's going on here? But then after hearing what the prosecutor had to say about this crazy story that Mary Jane had just told him, the doctor agreed that, okay, yeah, we do need to do this. And so the next day, February 22nd, a team of men with shovels, along with the prosecutor and the doctor, headed up to the Hilltop Cemetery where Zona was buried, and they dug her casket up, and then they carried the casket down to the local schoolhouse, and then once she was inside, the workers lifted her body, which was fairly well preserved because the ground was so cold. They lifted her body out and they placed it on a table, and then everybody left except for the doctor and the prosecutor. And once the room was clear, the doctor and the prosecutor began examining Zona all over again. And within about 30 seconds of this re-examination of Zona's body, basically at the exact same time, the doctor and the prosecutor, who were on either sides of the body, saw the thing that Mary Jane had alluded to in her wild story about her daughter. And so the doctor and the prosecutor, they're seeing this thing, they look up at each other and they can't believe it. Mary Jane's story had to be true. The following is Mary Jane's wild story. On the day of Zona's funeral, even though Mary Jane was overcome with grief over losing her daughter, the feeling that she really was harboring was hatred towards Erasmus. She hated Erasmus. She had always hated him. But now it was like her daughter is dead and she's forced to watch this guy sob and cry over her daughter's casket, when in her mind she's like, this funeral is about her. It's not about you. And so the whole funeral, she's just staring at Erasmus, channeling all of her energy towards hating him. But then, as she's doing this, a new emotion began to creep up on her that she couldn't quite describe. Basically, it felt like something was terribly wrong. And intuitively, Mary Jane felt like the only person who could explain what this thing was that was wrong kind of in her life somewhere was her daughter, Zona, who was obviously dead. And so this feeling that something is terribly wrong, it completely consumed Mary Jane's mind. And so by the end of the funeral, she wasn't mad at Erasmus. She was just thinking, how do I get in touch with my daughter? I need to get answers from my daughter. And so when the funeral ended, Mary Jane just left the funeral as fast as she could. She went home, she went into her bedroom, and she knelt down and she began to pray. Not for peace or strength in this difficult time, but instead, she prayed for her daughter's ghost to appear to her and tell her what was wrong. And for the next month, that is all Mary Jane did. She was obsessed with this idea that she needed to basically conjure her daughter's ghost to tell her what this thing was that was wrong. And so that was why she was acting totally crazy. All she did was pray and then look for signs that her daughter's ghost had come or was on her way. And so she'd be up all night kind of looking around, hoping her daughter would suddenly appear. And then when she would go outside, the reason she was muttering is because she was still praying under her breath, and she was always looking over her shoulders because she thought her daughter would appear any moment. And then finally, one night in the middle of February, so this is a month into Mary Jane's attempts to conjure her daughter's ghost, she was in her room, she was praying like she normally did with all of her candles lit, and all of a sudden, as she's kneeling down praying, this bright light appears in the middle of her room. And as this light suddenly appeared, the room began to get really cold. And Mary Jane is staring at this light thinking, this is my daughter. But then just as quickly as the light and the cold that came with it had appeared, it disappeared. And so Mary Jane was both really excited because she felt like, okay, the prayers are working. That had to be my daughter's ghost or some sign that my daughter's ghost is going to come here. And so Mary Jane just doubled down on her prayers. She knew she was close to getting her daughter to show up. And so over the next 2 days, that bright light would appear 2 more times, and each time it would just quickly disappear. But again, Mary Jane is thinking, okay, something's happening. My prayers are working. And then finally, on the 4th night, as Mary Jane is in her bedroom praying, the light appears in the middle of her room. It starts to get cold. But then instead of the light disappearing, Mary Jane would describe seeing her daughter kind of step out of this light and suddenly appear in the room. Mary Jane said that her daughter was dressed all in black and her skin was very pale and her eyes were these dark pits and her hair was straight down right over her shoulders, and she was staring at her mother. And Mary Jane, when she saw this, even though she had been trying for a month to get her daughter's ghost to appear, now that it seemed to be happening, she was terrified. And so Mary Jane began backing up right as this ghost begins walking towards Mary Jane. But then Mary Jane, as she's up against the wall, tells herself, you have to be strong. You need to talk to the ghost. You need to figure out what's wrong. And the only question that Mary Jane was able to come up with was, how did you die? And when she asked this question, Zona's ghost came to a stop. And then when Zona opened her mouth, dirt poured out. And then with a raspy, low voice, she began to tell her mother a story. She told her that Erasmus appeared to be this wonderful person to the community, but behind closed doors, he was a monster. He hit her and screamed at her over the littlest things. And then on the night of January 22nd, so one day before Zona would be discovered at the base of the stairs by Erasmus's helper, Zona's ghost would tell Mary Jane that Erasmus had become enraged at Zona over the food she had made that night for dinner. He had wanted meat and she had made something else, and so he was furious. And when Zona tried to tell Erasmus that she would make more food, or there was other food for him to eat, to just just please calm down, Erasmus stood up and he grabbed Zona by the neck and he lifted her off the ground. And right at this moment in this story that Zona's ghost is telling Mary Jane, the ghost would stop speaking, and this look of abject terror would come across the ghost's face, as if she was suddenly reliving this moment that happened with Erasmus. And as she's standing there with this horrible look on her face, the ghost began to levitate off the ground, and then it opened its mouth. And as it did, no sound came out, but instead, it was like all the air in the room was getting sucked into this ghost's open mouth. And then all of a sudden, there was this loud cracking sound as the ghost's head suddenly violently whipped around 180 degrees, but the ghost's body was still facing towards Mary Jane. And after this happened, Mary Jane is sitting there totally dumbstruck, and the ghost suddenly drops back down onto the ground, still with their chest facing Mary Jane, but their face pointing behind them. And then Zona's ghost turned around and began walking out of the room, and because she had turned her body around, that meant her head, which was facing the wrong way, was now oriented towards Mary Jane again, and Mary Jane would say the ghost was smiling, and then right before Zona's ghost left, she would say to her mother, "Now do you see what he did to me?" And then Zona just vanished, and the room became warm again, and Mary Jane, who was suddenly feeling so exhausted, just sat down on the bed and wept. Mary Jane had, the next morning, promptly gotten up and rushed to the prosecutor's office and told him the story of seeing her daughter's ghost and how the ghost had told her that Erasmus had throttled her and that was what killed her. Now, the prosecutor was really moved by Mary Jane's story, but it was when he rushed to the doctor to ask about re-examining Zona's body to see if she had marks on her neck from where she could have been throttled. That was when the doctor actually told the prosecutor that when he did the examination of Zona's body on the day she was found, he would say that Erasmus spent the entire examination at the head of the bed, cradling Zona's head and brushing her hair. But now that he was thinking about it, he could have been covering up her neck with the hair. And then also they thought about the funeral when right before Zona was lowered into the ground, Erasmus placed a scarf claiming it was his wife's favorite around her neck when she was buried. Again, perhaps trying to conceal the fact that there were marks on her neck. And when they did exhume Zona's body and they removed that scarf that Erasmus had placed, they would see there were marks all over her neck that looked like fingerprints. And then upon further examination, they would see that her neck was actually dislocated and that her windpipe had been crushed. Erasmus would be arrested for the murder of his wife just minutes after the doctor and prosecutor, basically at the same time, saw the marks on Zona's neck during their re-examination. During Erasmus's trial, Mary Jane would take the stand and she would tell the story of her daughter's ghost coming to her and explaining that Erasmus had killed her. And the testimony was so compelling that the jury found Erasmus guilty, even though there was no motive. Basically, they convicted him on the strength of Mary Jane's ghost story. Erasmus would be sentenced to life in prison, but he would die just 3 years after being incarcerated from a mystery illness that passed through the prison. It would also turn out that Erasmus had been married 2 times before marrying Zona. One of his wives had divorced him for being abusive. The other wife died in a freak accident when she was helping Erasmus fix their chimney when all of a sudden a brick fell loose and hit her in the head. Today, there is a plaque right near the cemetery in West Virginia where Zona was buried that reads in part, "Only known case in which testimony from a ghost helped convict a murderer." So that's going to do it. If you
echoes of a love we couldn't keep. Shadows play on walls that saw it all. In this empty house, we watch it fall. Photographs are scattered on the floor. Every smile now feels like a caustic lore.
If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our podcast, which has hundreds more stories, many of which are not on YouTube. They are exclusive to the podcast. So if you like this kind of storytelling, you can find